All right, it's 2 o'clock and we're going to get started. Welcome, everybody. I'm very happy to see so many of you here and interested in our newly improved cost allocation calculators. I'm Nancy Doherty, an analyst here at National RTAP, based out of our Massachusetts office, and I manage our array of tech tools, including, of course, cost allocation calculator, GTFS Builder, Procurement Pro, and the Integrated National Transit Database. So we're offering this webinar, most importantly, as a training for new users and as a refresher for those that need it. We will also present the newly enhanced calculators, which now provide even easier access to expense code definitions. Obviously, if you're cost allocating expenses, it's important that the expenses be assigned to the correct object class and subclass as defined by the Uniform System of Accounts. So as you probably saw, the webinar is being recorded, and the recording and the slides will be posted on our website. Probably usually takes like 2 days for us to do that. Sometimes we can get it done quicker, but they will be available. And if you do have questions, just enter them in the chat box. And unless it's really, really important, we'll probably address them towards the end of the webinar. And if you are having any trouble with Zoom, you can chat with us and we'll do our best to help you. And then finally, at the end of the webinar, you will be redirected to a survey, and we'd really appreciate it if you take it. We'd like to know what we've done really well and what we haven't done so well, so we can do a better job next time. So just some brief information about the National Rural Transit Assistance Program. We are a technical assistance center funded by the Federal Transit Administration, the FTA, through the Section 5311 program for rural areas. We provide no-cost training and technical assistance and webinars on a variety of topics for rural and state RTAP programs. We're guided by a review board member made up of one half DOT and one half transit providers. And Jessie, one of our speakers, is actually on our board. We're really, really excited that she's with us today. And the board helps us with what priorities, what topics we need to develop, and they're basically our boots on the ground. Everything we offer can be found on our website, nationalrtap.org. This includes 10 excellent instructional videos on the cost allocation calculator. You can reach out to us with any questions as well, of course. We may not know the answer, but we will definitely find the answer for you. So sometimes the wide range of services we offer can be a bit overwhelming, so we break it out into these basic categories. We are really well known for our training materials and all kinds of information on rural and tribal information through tech briefs, best practices, and toolkits. We offer a bi-weekly e-newsletter full of great information. We have the different technology tools, which I already mentioned. We also have website design available. Website Builder is one of our tools that so if you don't have a website, we can help with that. We offer conferences, roundtables, which allow folks from all over the country to network. And at the end of this training, we'll go over a few up-and-coming events, including our national conference in Austin, Texas in December of this year. So we have two great speakers with us today. I'd like to introduce them briefly. Currently serving in the Ohio Department of Transportation's Office of Transit as the Public Transit Manager, Jessie. Jessie oversees the administration and programming of federal and state transportation grants across the state. And as the mobility manager, she completed coordinated transportation plans, provided direct transit training to community members, and fosters partnerships between a wide range of local organizations to meet community transportation needs. And as I mentioned, she is a member of our National RTAP Review Board. Mike Walk is a research scientist and program manager in the Transit Mobility Program at Texas A&M Transportation Institute, more commonly known as TTI. He has 16 years of management and executive experience in public transit. He leads TTI's efforts in providing transit research, technical assistance, such as working on developing this cost allocation calculator, and training to local, state, and national sponsors. He's a researcher by training and a transit professional by trade. And his work helps transit agencies and other transportation providers to bridge the gap between innovation, research, and practice. And again, welcome to our panelists and to all of you that are joining us today. So at this point, I am going to turn the presentation over to Jessie to tell you a little about her experience at Ohio DOT and the cost allocation calculator.
Great. Thank you so much, Nancy. So, hi, everybody. As Nancy said, my name is Jessie Schmitzer. I'm a public transit manager at the Ohio Department of Transportation's Office of Transit. I'm just going to kick us off here before we get into the real meat and potatoes with Mike about the CAC calculator. So, if we could do next slide, please, Nancy. So cost allocation, why it matters from a state DOT perspective. There's a lot of different reasons why this matters to us and why it should matter to you. One of the biggest ones is that this really comes up in our annual program applications. So we take applications annually for a lot of the programs that we administer, as probably many of your state DOTs do as well. Having a really solid idea of your cost allocation is going to help you submit some more accurate budget submissions. And that's when it comes to either if you're applying to do preservation costs of what you're currently doing, or if you want to expand, you're going to really come to us to the table with some solid budget numbers of what that's going to look like for you. This will also lend itself to a decrease in lapsing fund. So if you have a solid budget of what that's going to cost you throughout the year, then at the end of the program year, you're not going to really have a significant balance that indicates to us that you had an inaccurate budget forecast for your operations, whether they be new or whether they're preservation. So it'll help you have a solid full budget of what you want to do. It matters to us, in a lot of different ways, mostly because if you are wrong with your budget and then there's lapsing funds, the funding could have gone to another transit agency that needed it as well. So from our perspective, that's a big thing for us. Another reason why it matters is, it helps you expect the unexpected. So if you run into some budget shortfalls, we, like to think we know what the year is going to look like, but we're in the transit world, so I think we know well enough to know that what we expect is not going to happen ever. Budget shortfalls are a common thing that happens, especially in rural transit. If you have a solid idea of what your service costs, then it's going to be easier for you to understand what services you may need to decrease in order to kind of like bridge that gap between your budget shortfall and what's needed exactly. This can also help you with some data that you can use to communicate to your stakeholders. If you ever have to reduce service, you can give them a solid number and you show them exactly what those costs are and where they're kind of hitting depending on what kind of service that you need to decrease. This can also be helpful for planning, so increase service opportunities, so it helps you understand the true cost of if you want to increase services. So I'm sure you guys hear it a lot too. I wish that the public transit agency could operate just a couple hours later in the afternoon or a couple hours earlier in the morning. This is going to help you have a solid idea of what that would actually look like for you if you wanted to look at maybe offering those more hours or expanding your service areas, whatever that may be. This is a good way for you to get a solid idea of what that would look like. And again, to have that data that you can then share with your stakeholders as you're kind of advocating for that and maybe some even local match to achieve those goals. So next slide, please, Nancy. And then another reason why it matters is for contract service agreements. I know a lot of rural systems will have contracted services that they offer. That's a really great way for them to come up with that really important local match that they need for operating and capital, projects. So having using the cost allocation calculator to get your fully allocated cost again is going to make sure that you're out there charging the true cost of the service that you're providing. So it's not really being subsidized by any other program, and then you're making the money that you should be making based on the services that you're providing. So that's going to make sure that your allocated rates are really right where they should be, and that you're not subsidizing it again with it's eventually going to get subsidized by your public transit money, which is what we don't want to see. So it'll help you with that accurate data again. And again, responding to RFPs or negotiating rates of service for contracted services is going to help you with that. So some common concerns. So ODOT kind of saw some things from our transit systems that we oversee. So the spark for us to kind of think about doing some training with the cost allocation calculator, where we saw some budgets that weren't really matching the true cost of service. We saw some contracted service rates that were far less than the agency's fully allocated rate. So again, that's being subsidized by the public transit funding, which is not really public transit. So we saw budgets that were not updated annually. We started to see kind of the same number come through every single year. And after COVID, we kind of knew that there was something weird going on there because everything went up. So we were seeing those same budgets every year. We saw increased funding requests with no data support provided or planning. So we really couldn't justify funding something if you can't show where you're getting those numbers from. We were seeing leftover funding at the end of the program year with some bloated budgets, and we also saw some budget shortfalls during the program year as well. So people weren't increasing as much as they should. Next slide, please, Nancy. So we decided to partner with National RTAP and Texas A&M Transportation Institute, and we hosted 2 National RTAP cost allocation calculator trainings for our subrecipients. We had one in December of 2022 and one in September of 2024. The goal was to provide the National RTAP CAC as a resource to be utilized during the annual application every year and throughout the program year as needed. So we encouraged both our rural transit directors and for them to drag along their fiscal staff to attend with them willingly or unwillingly. Next slide, please. So when we started the training, this is what we heard a lot of the folks that came say, and it was really, I made a horrible mistake signing up for this once they saw kind of the slides and all the papers and stuff. What in the world does this mean? This looks really complicated for my small rural transit program. There was a lot of doubt. There was a lot of concern. I think I stopped a couple people from sneaking out the door when I wasn't looking. But upon wrap up, what we really heard is, some people exclaiming, I didn't blow up the spreadsheet, so nothing blew up. We had a lot of folks say my cost allocation rates and fully allocated cost amounts were way off. So it really gave them a better idea of, wow, I probably should, get a solid number here. And although it looks intimidating, they understood it now. So there's a lot of people that kind of felt more comfortable doing the calculator and using it. So next slide, please. So the cost allocation now, we currently use it in our application cycle every year. We would request that agencies provide their fully allocated rates as part of our application to make sure that they're kind of where they should be on that scale. And we strongly encourage all of our 5311 subrecipients applying to use this tool to generate a lot of those numbers and to generate their budgets. So next slide, please. So my parting advice to you before I hand it off to Mike here is don't be afraid of the calculator. It will not blow up. A lot of people tried, it did not blow up. So feel free to tinker around with it and mess around. It'll tell you if something's wrong or missing. I'd encourage you to try something new. So the Excel version is really great, and that's usually what I go for because I'm so used to Excel, but the Access version may work better for you. I know a lot of people have actually said it works way better for them. So just be open to trying either one, and then use it throughout the year or at the very least annually. So once you feel comfortable with it, make sure you're updating it as you go throughout your year. Keep in mind that this also keeps all your data saved. So that's great year to year to year. You can kind of it'll save it for you and you can go through it every single year. So with that, I will hand it over to Mike, and then good luck with the cost allocation calculator, everybody.
Thank you so much, Jesse. Well done. Yeah, people are generally pretty happy with it when they spend a little bit of time learning about it. So, well done.
Thanks, Jesse. And you can hear me okay? All right. So this is Michael with TTI, and thank you, Jesse, for that introduction and background about how the calculator is actually used in real life. So let's go ahead and walk through just the goals of my portion of the webinar today. The first is I want to first cover the concept of service-based operational cost allocation in case you're not familiar with conceptually what cost allocation is. You really want to understand these concepts before you start using the cost allocation calculators. Then we'll walk through the basics of the cost allocation calculator so you understand the structure and how the flow of data works in the calculators. And then we'll also talk about the new features of the updated calculator, which now is version 4.1, available for download from National RTAP's website. So let's start with the basics of service-based operational cost allocation. So when you think about cost allocation, the basic idea here is that we have costs as a transit provider, and if we want to figure out how much of those costs are attributable to a single mode or a single route or a single service that we operate, we have to allocate those costs. And we're going to use transit service data, some things like miles and hours, to do that cost allocation. And we'll look at some graphical examples in just a little bit. But cost allocation is actually really, really critical when the complexity of assigning a specific cost to a specific service is just too complex or too burdensome. The example I like to give is if you really want to know exactly how much a fixed route cost you and you wanted to track it exactly, then you would have to know exactly how much fuel went into the vehicles that were driven on that route and that route alone. And you have to separate the fuel from the route you're trying to cost from the other routes. You'd have to know exactly which drivers, because they all have maybe different wage rates, right? So actually getting to that that finite level of detail is way too complex, way too burdensome. And so we use cost allocation approaches to take costs like fuel and like wages, kind of lump them together, and then we'll assign them or allocate them to our routes in order to get a cost of our routes or services. Next slide, please. So this is just basic example. Look, if you think of this concept graphically, we have some costs. We call those a cost pool. And this, for example, could be bus operator, wages, for instance. And those are all in our big cost pool. And if our question is, well, how much do we want to assign to Route 1 or Route 2 or Route 3? Then we need to figure out how to take the cost from the cost pool and assign them to the route. You can advance the slide. I think there might be some arrows. There we go. Right, so we do that using a shared variable. If we have shared costs, and we want to assign those shared costs to our routes, then how can we do that? We need some sort of variable that all the routes have as our allocation basis. Next slide. In the cost allocation calculator, there are two key variables that are used to do that allocation. The first is vehicle hours. So vehicle hours, if you're not familiar with the concept, this is essentially the sum of time, right, that your vehicles are in operation. This includes revenue operation and non-revenue operation, excluding hours not related to transit service, right? So maintenance, testing, or something like that, right? So these are your vehicle hours, and this is our key allocation variable to allocate hours-based expenses. That is, expenses that you have as a transit agency that are driven mainly by the number of vehicle hours that you operate. A great example of this is operator wages. The second cost allocation variable that the calculators use is vehicle miles. Again, this is the sum of miles or distance traveled from your vehicles in revenue operation. And we use vehicle miles to allocate miles-based expenses, expenses that are mainly driven by the miles driven, for instance, maintenance and fuel. Next slide. So if we take our original concept of where we have a cost pool and we want to assign costs in that pool to our individual routes, now that we've picked a variable like vehicle hours, we can use that variable to assign our hours-based costs to each individual route. So in the example you see through the different dollar signs that Route 1 has the least vehicle hours out of all three routes. So it's going to get assigned the least proportion of our hours-based costs. Route 2, sort of in between. Route 3 is the most. So Route 3 is going to get the highest proportion of our hours-based costs. Next slide. So all of that being done, all of that math in the background is happening in the cost allocation calculator. So the cost allocation calculator will kind of do the math for you. So what is the cost allocation calculator? It's essentially a tool, right? It's a software application, and it will help you accurately and consistently allocate your costs to your routes or services. The tool is in two different versions. One is in Microsoft Excel, the other is in Microsoft Access. They both have the same general functionality. Third, really these calculators require no special skills. It's just button clicking and data typing. So as long as you can do that, then you can use these calculators. And the calculators themselves rely on standard transit data, right? You shouldn't have to collect new data that you're not already collecting in order to use the calculators. And once you have all that data and you put it into the calculator, you can use it to allocate your costs to your individual routes or groups of routes and services. Next slide. So both of these tools, if you've never downloaded them before or you want to download the new version, you can visit National RTAP's Cost Allocation Calculator website. You can see a screenshot of it here on your slide, and then the link is available on the slide deck, or if you just Google National RTAP Cost Allocation Calculator, you'll probably get to the right page. There's also a support site where you can look at the manual, and there's also the videos that Nancy was talking about earlier. Now, both the manual and the videos do still need to be updated to reflect the minor modifications in version 4.1 of both calculators, and that'll be happening soon. Next slide. When you're looking at the calculators, it doesn't matter if it's Excel or Access. They're basically 4 steps. The first step is to enter your service data. So these are the actual routes or services that you want to assign costs to. You enter your financial data. And this is your expenses. You'll enter your operational data. And those are the hours and miles and passenger trips attributable to each service you entered in step 1. And then the magic button, right? Step 4, that's actually running the allocation calculator. All of these steps are shown on the navigation menu of both of the tools. Next slide. So when you use the calculators, what do you get out of them? And some of these things you already heard Jesse talk about. The fact that you have a consistent, equitable, transparent cost allocation process. The data from your cost allocation results can be used to support your NTD reporting or perhaps to report data to your state. It helps you to know the cost of individual services, measure performance, things like cost per passenger trip or cost per mile. And you can use the outcomes for planning and pricing services, preparing requests for reimbursement, setting your sponsored rates, and to automate some aspects of your accounting processes. Next slide. So what I'd like to cover now, we've walked through the basics of the calculator, is to hone in on what's new in version 4.1 of both tools. The biggest improvement is that now there's more details for expense codes. Admittedly, that entering financial data is the most complex part of doing cost allocation, particularly if you have a complex system with many different kinds of costs. You may have to enter several line items of costs. And so when you're doing that cost entry, you must assign an expense code to each cost you enter. The expense code you select determines how the calculator treats or allocates that particular cost. In the calculator, specifically, financial data entry requires that you enter expenses by object classes and by what we call subclasses, which are essentially transit functions. The object classes and subclasses in the calculator are adopted from the Uniform System of Accounts, or USOA, which is the standard guide for chart of accounts in public transit. And we recognized and heard from users that when I'm doing financial data entry, there's so many drop downs, there's so many options in terms of expense codes, it's hard to know what is the right object class and subclass combination for the expense I'm trying to enter. And plus, because there's so many options, it's hard to know even what options are available to me as a user. So what we did is that we created an expense code list, and we built better definitions. And this expense code list is actually in both calculators. You can view the whole list of possible expense codes to help you make a decision about how to classify your expenses. We also, in the Excel tool in particular, we added an expense code definition box to the Excel tool, so you can see the definition of the code that you've picked. And we've added a searchable expense code tab so that you can actually search for keywords and find the expense codes that contain that word you're looking for. There are also some removal of some expense codes that weren't actually applicable to cost allocation, even though they were in the USOA. Next slide. So let's talk about this concept of expense codes. If you think about an expense code, this means that you have an expense and you need to assign it a code. A code is a unique combination of a particular object class, that's the type of the cost, and a subclass, that's really the transit function or how the cost was used. Again, expense codes determine how the calculator allocates the entered cost. All told, there's 80 possible combinations of object class and subclass, which means there are 80 unique expense codes in the calculator. Now that might sound like a lot and be daunting, but let's unpack it a little bit. They were always there, and hopefully we've given you more resources so you can better understand how to find the right one. Next slide. This slide shows you the list of object classes on the left and the subclasses on the right. Again, when you're entering an expense, it's important to remember that in a costs object class tells you what kind of expense it is. These object classes all align directly with the Uniform System of Accounts, or USOA, and you can see examples here. So for instance, if you paid a consultant to do some work, what kind of cost is that? then that would be services. That's the kind of cost. If you were paid operators to do something, right, then you have operators' salaries and wages. That is an object class or a kind of cost. Now, when you look on the right-hand side, the question would be for those services or those operator salaries and wages, how were that cost used? So for services, if we used a consultant to do an audit, for instance, then those services, the object class, would be used on the subclass of administration to support the general administration of the transit agency. Now, not all subclasses are available for each object class selected, and we'll see some examples of that as we do a demo of the calculator. Next slide. This slide gives you a few concrete examples of how different expenses would actually be entered with a combination of object class and subclass. So if we look at the first row of this table, we can see expense code 5011.1. That refers to the object class of operator salaries and wages that were used for the subclass of operations. So you would enter in your expense of operator salaries and wages with a subclass of operations when those salaries and wages were paying operators to operate their vehicles. And the calculator is going to take that expense and allocate it using vehicle hours, because that's an hours-based cost. If you go down to the second row, you can see that for the same type of cost, that is operator salaries and wages, if they were used on the subclass vehicle maintenance, this would be when operators are doing vehicle maintenance duties. This might happen in a small shop where an operator maybe, 95% of the time is doing operations, but then 5% of the time is doing vehicle maintenance work. The cost associated with that pay should be allocated using vehicle miles, and therefore that cost needs to be entered with the object class salaries and wages, but the subclass vehicle maintenance. I'm not going to walk through every single example here on the slide, but hopefully this helps to demonstrate how when you pick a class and a subclass, that ultimately determines how that cost will be allocated. Next slide. So let's take a look at this in real time, sort of how it works. I'm going to do a live demo of the calculator. I'm going to start with the Microsoft Access calculator. So let me get my screen share going. Okay, so let me know if you can't see my screen, but then what we're doing here is we're looking at the Microsoft Access calculator.
Mike,
and yeah,
just before you get into your demonstration, we did have one question from Jenna Lyotte from ARP. Her question is, maybe you can see it in the chat, but some transit agencies provide Medicaid and EMT services, and she thinks that the CMS does not allow deadhead miles. I'm not sure if you can address that question. Could this cost allocation model be used for an EMT cost allocation?
That is a really good question, and if I try to answer it, I probably will end up misspeaking. So I know that is an issue. There's some discussion of that issue in even the National RTAP cost allocation manual. And there's also a project underway specifically for Medicaid and EMT cost allocation. So I would rather kind of get back to that question perhaps later or as a follow-up, if that's okay.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks, Nancy. So we're looking at the Access calculator here, and this is the navigation menu. And you can see the 4 steps that I had talked about during the slideshow, where we have enter service data, financial data, operational data, and then running the cost allocation. So we'll always start with step 1, the entering service data. So I'm going to click that button, and then we have a data entry screen, which is where we would enter in our routes and services. So it's important to remember that you're entering in step 1 any route or service that you want to allocate costs to, right? So if you have several fixed routes, you would want to enter in each fixed route separately. If you have fixed routes that cross urban and rural boundaries, and you'd want to be able to separate your urban related costs and your rural related costs. You'd want to enter in two line items, one for the rural portion of the route and one for the urban portion of the route. If you have demand responsive service, perhaps you operate a shared ride demand response where you're commingling general public dial-a-ride with human services transportation. Now that would likely only be one entry. That would be your demand response service because it's still one service, but then you're sharing seats on those demand response vehicles, which is a sponsor allocation, which happens later. So I've already entered in some data, so you didn't have to watch me do it all, but you can see we've entered in two routes so far, Route 1 and Route 2. We have one more route we'll enter just so you can see what it's like doing this in Access. We're going to save and add a new service, and that blanks out our screen so we can enter in our service. We're going to call this just our dial-a-ride service. Our mode here is demand response. You can pick it from the drop-down or even start typing the word demand response and then just hit the tab key so that it saves it and you can move down. This demand response service operates in our rural area. Again, you can use the drop-down to see what areas we have. You can also come up with your own names for your areas. For instance, if you want to put in a specific UZA or urbanized area, you can do that. So we're going to check our service area here. For this one is rural. This is a directly operated service. Again, this is just hypothetical. I'm kind of making this up for our example. If you don't know the definitions of these terms or what does this mean, you can look at the glossary. This glossary is available in both tools to try to find out, well, what does type of service mean? And so you can actually view the glossary for this specific form and find the term type of service. Oop, I hit the wrong button, my bad. 1 second. What I was looking for is directly operated. So we can see the term directly operated and the definition. And so this glossary is available for you in real time. Whatever form you're looking at defines all the terms on the form. I'm going to go back to our other form here. Now the sponsored type, this is sponsored service. What that means is we have this demand response vehicles driving around, but we have multiple funding sources. We've got human services, transportation, maybe two sponsors in this case, all sharing rides in addition to general public rides. And our primary funding source is, for this service, again, I'm making this up, is 5311. You can view or edit funding sources. If you have multiple sources, you would handle this through having multiple sponsors of the source of the service later. Really, this goal is just to identify what's the primary federal funding source for this particular service. Okay, so we've added in our dial-a-ride service. Everything, all the information's in here. We can just click save and close form, and now we have 3 services. It's going to ask us, hey, are you sure you want to exit? We're going to say yes. Okay, so our service data is there. We've got 3 services entered. Now I'm going to do a quick demonstration on entering financial data. This is step 2. I've already entered $1 million worth of expenses. We had $1 million in operator salaries and wages, and we're going to add in a few line items from our chart of accounts for the last fiscal year in order to account for the rest of our costs. So on this particular screen, the button that you click is to save and add a new cost entry. So we're going to click that. And the first, yep.
Mike, sorry, this is kind of a timely question, and I think I know the answer, but I'm gonna send it to you anyways.
Okay.
Does the calculator have an option to add both revenue and service miles?
Yes. Yes, but the calculator is built to allocate costs using service miles, not revenue miles. So costs get allocated using total service miles, or what we call total vehicle miles. But revenue miles is entered. You can enter it optionally so that you can calculate your cost per revenue mile as an output.
Thanks.
Okay. Okay. So what I'm going to demonstrate next is how to use the expense code list or to understand what the definition of a particular expense code is. We've already entered in some operator salaries and wages. And let's say hypothetically, I know that I'm supposed to separate costs by function. I know that costs that are associated with vehicle operations is one kind of cost, but if I paid operators to do vehicle maintenance, that's a different cost type. And so I need to separate those two out and report them separately. I already know the object class is operators, salaries, and wages. Again, we can start typing in the drop-down box or use the drop-down box to find the code that we want. This is the object class, operators, salaries, and wages. Now, when we come to the subclass box, I have these 4 options, right? And so here's where the question comes. Well, do I call this operations? Do I call it vehicle maintenance? Do I call it facility maintenance? Do I call it administration? One way to make that decision is if you have a basic idea of what your object class is, you can look through the different definitions of each subclass by selecting the subclass. When I select the subclass, I see it was the operations subclass. And in this green box, I have the definition of the expense code. It tells me how the cost will be allocated, right? So it's an hours-based cost. It tells me what transit function that if you're reporting to NTD and the 4 transit functions, then it also tells me that, and it gives me the definition. Now the definition is longer than can be seen here. And so you can click for more and it will give you the full definition of this expense code. In addition to that definition, which is shown here, you can also see what page numbers and sections from the USOA where this expense code is actually listed and defined. So if you're like, okay, what is the definition of the function of operations for operators, salaries, and wages? Well, that's on page 52 of the USOA in section 5.1.1. So that is helping you get all the reference material you need in order to have confidence that, is this the right code for me? And we see in this case, this is for operators for time spent performing vehicle operation activities, actually driving vehicles. So that's not what I want. This is time spent doing vehicle maintenance. So, I mean, it seems pretty obvious here, but I'm going to pick the vehicle maintenance subclass. And if I want to check the definition, again, I can look at the definition and see that it's for operators for time spent conducting vehicle maintenance activities. And it gives a couple of examples. So great, now I feel like I have the right expense code. So I'm gonna leave this as is and then put in my cost. Again, these costs are just made up for purposes of the demonstration. It's nice to have some information. So in this case, we have operator salaries and wages for vehicle maintenance. We have $100,000 of that. The last question you need to answer when you're doing cost entry is to what services does this cost apply? And so it can either apply to all of your routes or services, or you can select that the cost applies to only a specific route or a specific mode or a specific service area or a specific type of service, right? Either directly operated or purchased, or even a specific primary funding source when you entered. All of these specifics are based on the characteristics you entered in step 1, right? The services. In our example, this is a shared cost, so we're going to allocate this cost to all of our routes and services. And I'll do one other example here before I keep moving on. I'm going to do an example of fuel and lubricants. Now, in this case, if I'm not really sure, again, I have 2 expense codes. I have one for operations. Sorry, I have 2 subclasses, right, which are 2 different expense codes. I have this one for operations and this one for vehicle maintenance. So if I know I paid for fuel, but you know, which code am I supposed to put this under? And it actually does matter. So I'm going to show you, instead of just clicking on the class and looking at the definition, we're actually going to view the entire expense code list. This is also available in the Excel application. When reviewing the expense code list, I can see all expense codes that are available for me. And we already knew this was a fuel and lubricants object class. So I'm going to filter all the expense codes just for that particular object class. So then I can see the definition of the 2 subclasses. We have operations and vehicle maintenance, and read the definitions in order to understand which one is the appropriate expense code to assign to this particular expense. Now, this is fuel used to propel revenue vehicles, as opposed to fuel used to propel non-revenue vehicles. Okay? And that's the big difference between these 2 expense codes. So because this is revenue vehicles, I'm going to choose the operations subclass. So I'm confident I know what code I want. So I'm going to close this and come back, make sure I'm using fuel and lubricants, operations subclass, and enter in my cost, $300,000. Okay, so that's just an example of how the cost entry works in the Access calculator, and how you can view the expense code list in real time and then view your definitions in real time as you select the class and subclass. I'm going to close this. The last part of the demo I'm going to show is entering operational data. So entering operational data is when you actually are putting in your hours and miles associated with each individual service. As you can see, I already entered in the data for Route 1. We have our revenue hours, miles, and passenger trips for Route 1 and for Route 2 already entered, but we haven't entered in data for demand response. So I'm going to enter in my revenue hours and vehicle hours first. And again, these are data I just made up, so you don't have to say figure out where they all came from. So let's say that we have 40,000 revenue hours and 50,000 vehicle hours. In terms of miles, I'm just going to input 100,000 revenue miles and 1 million vehicle miles. And then we carried a total of 80,000 people on this particular service. And last but not least, with a service like this, we have demand response. We have these demand response vehicles driving around, but we have two different sponsors paying for trips on those vehicles. And so because this is a sponsored type of demand response service, we're then going to enter in passenger hours and mile data to allocate the sponsored services. So when you have sponsors, you need to determine what sponsors you have for Dial-A-Ride, and you enter their data individually here. I already created the sponsors to save us some time, but so we're going to have a short trip sponsor. And for each sponsor, I need to know for the trips that were paid for by the sponsor, what were the passenger hours and passenger miles and passenger trips covered by this particular sponsor. In this hypothetical example, we have our short trip sponsor, and passengers taking trips under this sponsor traveled a total of 30,000 hours and 600,000 miles, and that was 70,000 passenger trips. I'm going to save and add another sponsor for my Dial-A-Ride service, pick the second sponsor, which is our long trip sponsor, and I'm going to input the passenger hours associated with this sponsor. And that was a total of 50,000 hours, 1 million passenger miles, and only 10,000 passenger trips. Okay, and so I'm going to save and close this information. And now I'm done entering service data for all three of my routes or services. And then last but not least, I can run the cost allocation. I'm going to click the Run Cost Allocation button, and now I have results ready for reporting. To see my results, we come down to the cost allocation reports and run the active year reports. So this is the data that we've currently entered, and we can see information like cost by mode. We'll look at that. And this is the kind of output that you'll have. Notice our total system is $1.4 million. We can see our costs, our hours-based, our miles-based vehicle operations costs, our vehicle maintenance costs. I didn't enter in any any fixed costs like facility maintenance and general administration, just for the sake of time. And then I also see our performance measures like passengers per hour and mile, our cost per hour, cost per mile, and also our cost per passenger trip, which are 78 cents per trip. That's pretty darn good. Again, that's because I didn't enter in that many costs. This is the kind of examples that results that you get out of the calculator. You can get reports like this. You can export those reports to PDF and also export your results to Excel if you want to then use that data in some other information. So that's just a quick demo of the Access version of the database. If we take a look at the Excel version, it looks very similar in nature, where we have the service data to be entered. That's step one. In this case, I put in all the service data already. So we can see we have our 3 services, remember our Route 1, our Route 2, and our dial-a-ride. And then on the financial data, I entered in most of the financial data already. However, I will show you, just do one financial data entry here. We'll put in a fixed cost like casualty and liability insurance. So we click the button, click to enter financial data, which opens up a financial data window, much like the Access version that I showed you before. You'll notice that we have a link to the glossary, a link to the expense codes, and then the expense code definition box. And these are all new in the Excel version of the tool. Let's take a look at the expense code list and say, we have, this is insurance, and I'm not exactly sure what to call it. So we're going to set our form here aside for the financial data. And we clicked on expense codes, and we're going to come into, this is the expense codes tab. Now you have the same filters that the Excel expense code list has. So you can filter if you know the USOA cost group or the object class or subclass, you can filter for those. But if you just want to search the definitions for a keyword, for instance, we want to look for things like insurance. I'm scrolled down, sorry. I need to scroll back to the top. That would be helpful, right? And so I started typing the word insurance, and this list has now been filtered down to just be one record. So it's expense code 5050.6, which the object class is casualty and liability costs, and the subclass is public liability and risk management. So I know for my insurance costs, this is where I'm going to, this is the expense code I'm going to use. So I'm going to come back to my financial data tab, form, find casualty and liability insurance. This is all alphabetical order. So that's my object class. There's only one subclass available, so that was nice and easy. And then again, we see the cost type here, the transit function here, as well as the full definition below. And it's the same features that were in the Access application. And we'll put in a cost. We'll just put in $200,000. Now, in the Microsoft Excel tool, if this is a shared cost, that means it applies to all services. You click the shared cost button. If this is a cost that applies to a single service, for instance, maybe just our demand response, then we would click just that single button, or we'd check the box beside that one particular service. We'll make this into a shared cost, and I will add it. It's very critical that you have all of your services added in step 1 before you start entering cost data in the Excel tool. The Excel tool assigns the cost to your services from step 1 in real time. So once I click add, you'll see, and I'm gonna save and exit. You'll see that in the data entry form section where I have all the data listed, my casualty and liability costs, $200,000, have already been assigned to my 3 services. So if you go back and add another service in step 1, then all of this cost data now becomes outdated because the cost will not be automatically assigned. That's why in the Excel tool, it's very critical that you enter the service data, correctly. You have everything there, then you start entering your financial data. In the Access tool, you can actually switch back and forth because the costs don't get assigned until you run cost allocation. Then the last step is the operational data. I already entered in all the operational data for our hypothetical service. This is the same data that I put in the Access calculator. And then last, we would run the cost allocation. So again, this is step 4. We're going to get different results than the Access because I just added different costs to this particular tool, but that's okay. So we're going to jump to step 4, this step 4 tab. We'll run the cost allocation. We get our results here below. And now while this is useful information, you can see the costs. If you click the button View Cost Allocation Reports, we'll assign it a fiscal year. We'll say this was for fiscal year 2025. And then we'll get a whole new tab with the results specifically for 2025. And you can see this is defined as a new tab called Summary Report. And we can see the allocated costs to all 3 of our routes or services for our system. How much gen admin was allocated, vehicle maintenance, hours-based vehicle operations, and hours-based miles-based vehicle operations, as well as all of the cost performance measures that you expected to see and that you saw in the Access tool. In Excel, all of the reports are kind of available all at once. You can see them by route, by mode, by service area, by type of service. And at the bottom, if you have sponsored service, like we did with our Dial-A-Ride, you will see the sponsored service cost allocation, which, as you can see with our long trip sponsor, our cost per passenger trip is almost $56, where for trips that are shorter, the cost per trip is only around $5. So as you can see, there's a big difference. So when you're setting that rate for these two sponsors, we would use different costs. If you're using a passenger trip based rate, you'd want to use a different number due to the significant difference in the length of the trips. And that is an overall demonstration of how to use both calculators. So Nancy, I'm gonna go back to you. I'm gonna stop my sharing. Okay, so a couple last things just to be aware of. If you use these calculators in the past, we did label the reports. We did change the column headers for vehicle operations and vehicle operations fuel. They were changed to these two labels you see: vehicle operations hours based and vehicle operations miles based, to better represent the costs that are being allocated in those particular columns. We also made some other improvements, like to the glossary, to form labels, and other tooltips. Next slide. If you need help with any of these tools, the calculators themselves provide resources for you, like the expense code list, like flowcharts that help explain how the calculators work, as well as a glossary. You can also seek support from the manual and the helpful videos that are available on the support page. You can also reach out to National RTAP or to myself, and we'll help you in whatever way you need. To use the Access application, you do not need to have Microsoft Access, because some people don't want to use the Access application because, well, I don't have Access. Microsoft has a free extension called the Runtime extension, which actually lets you run Access files without needing to have an Access license, and that's free. Next slide. All right, I guess we'll stop there and open it up for questions and answers.
I'm going to start with Lise Marie. You had your hand raised some time ago, so I'm giving you the opportunity to jump in and ask your question directly. So if you unmute yourself, you can do that.
Hello, I honestly didn't mean to press the button.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, I didn't mean to press the button. I'm sorry.
Oh, I guess I couldn't hear you. Okay.
It's very interesting though.
Thank you.
First time.
All right. And then there's one more. I think Jenna Layout wanted to ask a question, or maybe wanted a little more detail about her question, if you wanted to jump in. And I think Robin had some thoughts on that as well. Jenna, if you unmute yourself, you can jump in if you'd like.
Okay. Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So my follow-up question, or actually a separate question, I'm just curious to know, of the transit providers that are using the scheduling and dispatch software, whether those software packages can pump out the inputs that you need for the cost allocation model, and also whether they're already doing cost allocation for the providers. And so this tool, like, is it useful if they already have those other tools? That's my question. I don't know how else to ask it.
No, I mean, I'll chime in just real quick. And you are correct that many, particularly demand response, dispatching and scheduling, platforms have a cost allocation component, which actually allow pretty robust cost allocation procedures to be applied to shared ride demand response circumstances, or multiple kinds of demand response services. However, in some cases, agencies aren't using those features to their full extent, or they have to pay extra for them. Or, if you're an agency and you have multiple modes, right, just having the demand response cost allocation doesn't actually answer all of your cost allocation questions, because some of it is, you might have multiple fixed routes, and fixed route scheduling software often does not have built-in cost allocation features. So you might need to use a mix of tools. And I think to answer your first question, most of the demand response scheduling software that I've seen is able to produce things like passenger hours and passenger miles, right, by program or by sponsor, that would allow you to get the results that you're looking for with the calculator if the software doesn't actually give you a cost allocation feature built in to the scheduling and dispatching software. It's a good question.
Great. Thank you.
Any other questions? Robin, I unmuted you if you wanted to add to anything that we said today.
Oh, no, I thought this was really great, super interesting. I think having Jesse start off with how they're using it and how that's really helping them. And what I often say when I'm doing presentations is good cost allocation makes good partnerships. And we all want to work with the people near us. We want to do the things that our community wants us to, and we want to be responsive. But I think cost allocation is such a great reality check, so that when people are asking you to just do something, you can say, well, that's great, we'd love to, and we have this much access to federal funds.
Yeah.
So I think it's super. And the thing is that this cost allocation is the same cost allocation that CCAM is working on. These are the same cost allocation model. And what this tool does is it gets you ready to use the CCAM model, which is then how do you allocate that cost per trip to potential funders or a multitude of funders. And you really can't allocate cost per trip until you have the cost per trip in your hand. And that's what this tool can do for you. And I super encourage this. And I think that the stories about how to use it are really helpful. I can just see this with your asset management, your vehicle utilization, all of these things that seem like wild calculations all of a sudden become doable and visible. So thanks so much, Michael and Jesse and Nancy, for putting this together. It really was a great workshop.
So I should have introduced Robin. She's our executive director here at National RTAP, so very knowledgeable on the topic. Michelle Williams had a quick question. We'll be posting the recording of the training online. It will be on the National RTAP website right under webinars, current webinars or past webinars, and we should have that up in a day or two. And then we did have another question from Johnny Cusack, who I'm going to allow to speak if you just give me a second to do that. Sorry, Johnny. Where are you? Oh, there you are. Okay. Okay, you should be able to speak, Johnny.
Hey, Nancy, can you hear me?
We can. Just speak a little bit louder, but yes.
Okay. Thank you. I'm on a different computer, so I could not tell if you could see my hand raised and the whole chat. It's totally different on here. But I did have a question for Michael or Jesse. Can you tell maybe for a smaller rural service that might have, let's say, just maybe they do like a couple different projects. Maybe they have funding from a couple different pools of FTA dollars, state dollars, that sort of things. We have a few more than that, but just your average, how long would it take them to initially maybe set something like this up with the codes and everything else to maybe kind of initially get them started?
Yeah, I think it's actually a really, really good question. I think sorry, I'm just trying to think through the steps in my own head, right? Yeah, I think the hardest part is usually the financial data piece, right? And so we've worked with agencies hands-on where they really already have all the data because they've set up their chart of accounts and their accounting system to give that information, that level of detail already. And then you have other cases where the data is too aggregated and the agency actually has to work to disaggregate it. So it can take anywhere from a half an hour to slightly more time. It might take a few hours of work to get the accounting system and the accounting experts set up. But that's the easiest way I can explain. I'd love to hear from individual users, and we're here to help at whatever point if agencies are having struggles with this.
Because I think it's a great tool. I know that some of my partners in Nebraska, they thought it was a little difficult, maybe getting it set up because they might need assistance from their accountant, just because of the codes and things like that. But I told them not to be frustrated because once they get it set up, it is a great tool to be able to take to county commissioners, to their city council meetings, things like that. I think another great tool to even pair with this is just a return on investment tool, which this reminds me of definitely. And so thank you for just sharing this with us, National RTAP.
Thank you, Johnny. We
Yes, thank
appreciate
you.
it. Unfortunately, Mike needs to, I know Mike had a hard
Go.
stop at 3. So maybe Jesse can stay on for another minute or two, or Robin, but I know we need to say goodbye to Mike, and we really appreciate you did a great job. And I'm going to send out your email to everyone, and they can reach out
Thank
to
you.
you if they have any questions, either downloading or using the tools.
Thank you very much.
Okay,
Take
thanks,
care.
Mike. Okay. Winnie, I know you had a question and you wanted to jump on. You should be able to unmute yourself. I'm not sure we'll be able to answer your question, but we'll try. And if not, we can, like I said, we can always send it off to Mike. You had your hand raised, Winnie.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Our operations mix fixed and demand response, and we have really hard time to do the direct cost. So the method we're using, the one you introduced us, can be counted as a direct cost instead direct expense.
Well, the
Because
cost
we can-
allocation calculator, there's no cost to use this tool. Is that what you're asking?
Because every year we have to get the waiver because we cannot get a direct cost to each mode. So if using this tool, can we say there's a direct cost?
I don't know. It's a cost allocation tool. I don't know, Robin, if you can jump in, but
So one of the things what I think I heard her say is that she's trying to understand the indirect versus direct cost.
Right.
And if she uses the cost allocation tool, will that allow her to identify the direct versus indirect costs in her set? And I think that's basically what it does. It creates it gives you a per hour number. If you're talking about getting your reimbursements, that it doesn't change the category of the cost, but what it can do is give you a total cost. It gives you information about what's already there, and it helps you walk through categorizing those costs. Because earlier, Jana Linet asked about whether you can't get deadhead reimbursement from Medicaid. They will allow you as a total cost, if it's part of the total costs, which then would be indirect costs, it's part of your total cost of service. And so in that sense, this tool allows you to identify things like deadhead miles that can be then averaged throughout your cost of contracting or your cost per mile for a Medicaid reimbursement.
all right, folks, thank you, Robin. I hope that helped, and you can reach out to us by email, and we can maybe go into more detail and forward your question to Mike if Robin didn't hit it exactly the way you wanted. I do need to close it out because it's after 3, and I know people are busy. But as the screen shows, we do have our technical assistance conference coming up down in Austin, Texas in December. We'd really love to see you there. I'm sure there'll be a presentation on cost allocation, so you can come and tell us how it went, assuming that you did give this a try. We also like to mention that we are part of the Technical Assistance Coordination Library. We're actually the leader of it, which provides sustainable methodology and a platform for informational, rural, and tribal coordination. And it's a library that combines information from FTA and all of its technical assistance centers. And then finally, this is the contact information that I promised, both Robin's and Mike Walks as well. Jesse, we didn't see you towards the end, which is fine, but you did a great job. And again, I really appreciated you joining us today. All right, well, thank you, everybody. I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.